Hello and welcome everybody to this session on entitled Help is Out There, What to Do in Cases of Deepfake Abuse. My name is Adam Dodge. I'm the founder of EndTAB. I will be the moderator today and we'll be learning right alongside everybody else from our esteemed panelists about what steps victims and survivors of deepfake abuse can take when they're targeted, the resources available to them, and really considering this in light of the institutional limitations that exist for victims and survivors of deepfake harm. And so this is going to be an in-depth discussion about a heavy topic, which we're going to acknowledge today, but hopefully you will come away with newfound knowledge about this subject matter and actionable things that you can incorporate into your work or your professional or personal lives in a way that will be impactful for your communities. So I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves and speak a little bit about their work in this area before we kickstart the panel. So Kate, would you like to begin?
Sure. Thank you so much, Adam. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever time zones we are in. It's really an honor to be here today. My name is Kate Keisel. I am the co-founder and co-chief executive officer at the Sanar Institute. I am really reflecting a lot on this panel and the ability to talk about support and how we move forward in healing and justice in the aftermath of image-based sexual violence. By training, I am a trauma therapist and an individual with lived experience in complex trauma and digital abuse. In addition to that, I am very honored to work with a team of clinicians who are working on IPSA and a number of different varieties, kind of whether that's trauma therapy, whether that's working on training or technical assistance, or our new project, which is Project Lighthouse, that we are launching sort of this month, maybe next month, in the very near future, that I'm excited to talk about for resources that are coming for individuals and other aspects of, thinking about standards of care for individuals and communities who have been impacted by image-based sexual violence. Before we get started today, I'm a trauma therapist through and through. I'm just going to do a little reminder to take care of ourselves. I know there's been a lot of heavy conversations and dialogue. And for those of us with lived experience of sexual violence or other forms of violence, or most of us as humans who just have experience with trauma across our life course, when we talk about this stuff, it can bring up our own things. It can, have a nervous system response. So I just wanted to invite everybody to take a couple of box breathing breaths before we jump in. And it's such an easy tool, right? We breathe in for 4 seconds, we hold for 4 seconds, we breathe out for 4 seconds, and we hold for 4 seconds. It's a great way to regulate our nervous system. I found myself prepping today, some of my own stuff coming up, and I was like, I need to go into my tools and skills. So I'm just going to model one, which is breathing in, holding, breathing out, holding. And that's something that whatever we're going through this evening, as we move into also watching the documentary this evening, these are great things that we can go on. I also have my trusty stress ball here. So just a reminder to lean into those things. It's my honor and pleasure to be here today, and I will pass it over to Adam once again.
Thank you, Kate. Yes, self-care, always just the life's work of our movement, right? It's so important, and I'm so glad you took the time to spotlight it for all of us today. Hera, would you like to talk about your background and your organization for everybody?
Yes, would love to. Thank you so much, Adam. I'm Hera Hussain. I'm the founder and CEO of Chayn. It's an organization I started almost 11 years ago, which supports survivors of gender-based violence across the world, especially tech-enabled violence. And our sort of work is around supporting the healing of survivors. We do this in multiple languages through resources that have been created with, not for survivors. So really thinking about like what can we do to hold spaces and enable survivors to, not feel alone on their healing journey. I am also joined by my 7-month-old whose head you kind of see in the background. he may pop his head in to the screen. So that may happen. And it's also, I just wanted to give a shout out to Adam as well. It's really great to have such an excellent moderator who's doing really fantastic work in this space. So I'm looking forward to what should be a really riveting conversation, and also looking forward to seeing what comes up in the Q&A too.
Well, thank you, Hera, for the shout out. Appreciate it. Really, this summit is so timely for those of us who work in combating gender-based violence. We're always dealing with emerging technologies and how those technologies will ultimately be misused and weaponized to harm victims. And when that happens, often the institutions that are in place to keep us safe have difficulty keeping pace with these new and emerging challenges, and it's left and the burden falls on victim service providers and the victims themselves. And what's exciting about this conference is we're really taking an emerging issue head on and making sure that people and communities around the world have the tools to address this. But we are also spotlighting the lack of institutional support. And when somebody is seeking help for deepfake abuse, they might run into a lot of challenges. Namely, people might not know what it is, might not know how to respond to it, might not be trauma informed when they do respond to it. So it's really, it's a challenging thing, but it's something that both of our panelists today have spent time working with victims and survivors of image-based sexual abuse and victims and survivors of what I call synthetic image-based sexual abuse, or deepfakes is what folks call them. But there's a panel today on why we maybe shouldn't call them deepfakes. So, but that's when I say authentic image-based abuse, I'm talking about real images. When I talk about synthetic, I'm talking about these AI-generated images as well, where victims are inserted into inserted into images and videos where they are appearing to either be nude or engaging in sex acts without their consent. So, Kate, can I ask you, since you have experience working with both victims and survivors, and by the way, folks, I use victim and survivor interchangeably because the folks that I work with, some identify as victims, some identify as survivors, and I want to honor that. So that's why I tend to use those differently. But Kate, having worked with both survivors of authentic image-based sexual abuse, the non-consensual distribution of intimate images and things like that, and victims of deepfake abuse, can you speak to any differences or lessons you've learned working with folks who are experiencing synthetic image-based abuse?
Thanks so much for that question, Adam. And I want to mention also with language that, in an emerging field such as this, where things are rapidly changing, I think language is a difficult thing to find commonalities and where we all feel empowered with the words we're using to describe it. So if at any time I use something that doesn't feel empowering or reflective of your experience or someone in your community, I think that we should all welcome that feedback in terms of getting to a place that we feel represented, but also, please let me know in the chat box or Q&A if that's for some reason not feeling like it's resonating. The work that we do at the Sanar Institute is we focus on long-term trauma-specific healing. So a lot of that starts with individual therapy, but that can also include things like case advocacy, connecting to legal services, resource support, law enforcement coordination, kind of that whole spectrum, right? And when we think about image-based sexual violence, and I'm going to just keep it easy and kind of use that as the blanket term for right now, and then try to, parse out these different places, it's really similar with what we see in interpersonal violence across the board at Sanar, right? There are things really unique to how this type of violence occurs in the way that, it's distributed, and I think in its prevalence of how it impacts every facet of our lives. So that's one of the things I think across the board, whether that is a synthetic image or one that was taken and distributed without our consent that may have come from a quote unquote real location. The reality is that whoever that is impacting, the underlying place of safety having been torn out and underneath that person is gone, right? So we're talking about abuse of power, privilege, trust, privacy, and that feels like it's really true within, whatever individual it is who's had this experience. Because at the end of the day, one of the things that we've seen in this work is that there isn't any place in our digital world today that we can go to feel safe, right? There's a lack of safety, there's lack of safety nets and a lack of understanding of what that looks like. And oftentimes we think about the initial violence or the ongoing violence of the sharing of non-consensual images. But what we also see is it is the ongoing, brutal, and relentless harassment that also comes with that every single day. So while we may have images removed, or we may that look certain ways for deepfakes or for, synthetic images versus others, at the end of the day, it's not just that form of violence and abuse that we see happening for individuals who are impacted. So I think I struggle on the, what are the differences or the observations? I think at a high level, sort of 60,000 foot view, one of the things that we've seen with individuals who have experienced synthetic IBSA is this idea that because it quote unquote didn't happen in the real world, that if it's taken down, that there's no damage that was left in the wake of this. And we have to think about what it is, one, first of all, to see that image ourselves when it's shared, right? This is a devastating, traumatic event. And then to continue seeing it over time. And then oftentimes for our communities to perceive this as something as simple as a prank, right? Which it goes far deeper than that on so many levels, as we all know, or to see it as something that isn't a form of violence and not true of peace. I think when we look at IBSA for, the whole spectrum of a day or two that we could spend on the different forms of what happens in that form of violence that maybe is content that was shared, that was either taken or CSAM material. There's also kind of this underlying piece of where is this unintentional victim blaming with that content, right? So I think we aren't winning in either one of these regards in these issues. And we have an obligation when we look at both of them to say, how can we do better and understand what's really happening for individuals who experience this form of violence?
Wow. Home run answer. That was great. Hera, how have deepfakes shown up in your work and your organization's work? How has it impacted the work that you do?
It's really interesting because I think that a lot of the attention so far has been paid on sort of celebrities, politicians, women in the public eye. And I think it's really important to hold space for that because the nature of those sort of, I would call them attacks, are so vicious, and it comes in such large droves. It can like destabilize people's careers, just really far-reaching consequences, even beyond someone's own personal trauma response. And what is interesting is that a lot of the research that's coming out is saying that younger people, so there was research that said like in Belgium, like 5 to 7% of people have generated a deep fake of someone. That's pretty high, I think, for and this is for young people, so people below the age of 25. And so I think the way people are going to start referring to this is also going to change, because in Spain recently, there was a case of 3 young boys who made videos of their deepfake pornographic videos of their classmates. And when they were interviewed, they couldn't fathom why it was wrong. And it was, which shows how we failed as a society, and really teaching young people digital citizenship, digital ethics. Digital citizenship is a concept like Shay Akiwogo, my close friend, has also been talking about. And really how do we do that? So I think the how it comes up in the work is very different. When I started, what you would say is the older form of image-based abuse, where there wasn't as sophisticated, it would take long for people to do it. People have been making pornographic images of women they've had a problem with for hundreds of years. We have really old cases. But what's different now is it's so easy. It can be free, and it can cost so little. So I think that's a big difference. And the secondly, I think, is that about us, how internet culture is changing how we view image and consent and bodies in the public space in general. I think that is different. So what I find is that a lot of people know that's wrong, right? It's they will say that it's wrong to do. People who've not grown up with this tech, which makes it really easy to generate images. But those who have, I think there's where the problem is. And that's where we're seeing the differences. I was just recently talking to someone who goes into schools and talks to and kids about this, and they said that it was something that came up in classrooms a lot, because for a lot of people it's just a bit of fun, especially when it targets someone in the public eye, because celebrities have their images everywhere, right? You see them on like advertisements that they have nothing to do with. People just stick their pictures on. But this idea of like, actually who owns like what is a bit of good fun, and where does that end? I think that is what it really goes into the roots of patriarchy, of like whose pain are we listening to, whose pain matters, whose shame is it to carry. All of these questions I think are now coming up more and more, and I'm expecting to see it a lot more in Jen's work. I think even now there's so much shame attached to it that people aren't speaking out. So I'm expecting, we launched a course last year on image-based abuse, and we're expecting, sorry, baby duties as well. I was expecting that there were going to be a lot more views of that course, because it's something that, is happening. But I think there's so much shame attached to it that even us like accessing survivors and telling them this exists has been a lot harder than we thought.
Yeah. First of all, amazing multitasking, Hera. Professional and personal lives colliding, and you're handling it beautifully. And thank you for that answer. Yeah, there's between both of your answers to this question, there's so much valuable information to mine there. My own thoughts, just to add them quickly, are what's happening with these undressing apps and these deepfake apps is, when we're talking about youth, first contact with this technology is not coming from trusted adults or parents or schools. It's coming from the algorithm on social media and the internet, right? And they are getting marketed, these apps on social media, with free introductory offers. And so something free, something that's being legitimized on a social media app that is so easy to do, seems harmless. It seems harmless. And so we have such an opportunity to educate youth and talk to youth in schools and raise awareness with parents and trusted adults to educate on this, because usually we are not the first point of contact. Usually we are reacting to these problems. And some folks say, well, aren't you just going to be introducing this technology so that they can misuse it? And my answer to that is, they're not likely to reverse engineer it from a safety presentation. They are finding out this information on their own. And we need to be the voice, not the internet, when it comes to how to use this technology safely or not use it at all. There's a question, Hera, how does someone access the course you mentioned? And I can, if you're wrangling your son, I know where it is, so I can answer it if you like, but go ahead.
It's okay. Thank you for that question. It's you can check it out on bloom.chayn.co. So if you go to chayn.co, you can find all of Chayn's services. Bloom is the service. It's free. And it's it's in English right now, but we'd be translating and localizing in many languages soon.
Thank you, Hera. So just to put a bow on that last bit, one thing I want to mention is many of these deepfake apps and these undressing apps don't only work on women and girls and female identifying folks. They are not trained to work on the bodies of men or male identifying individuals. So a lot of the attention on this issue, when we're talking about victims and survivors, tends to focus on women and girls and female identifying victims. However, we do know that men and boys and male identifying folks are also targeted. Kate, can you talk a little bit about your work in working with victims and working with male identifying survivors of deepfake abuse?
Sure. Thank you so much, Adam. One of the things I think in general, when we talk about sexual violence in men and boys, we don't do a great job, right? We do not necessarily create inclusive spaces. And there are often times where we see individuals that feel such a degree of stigma and self-blame and shame, and the messages of what masculinity needs to look like in our society today are at odds with the desire, need, or space to get help. And I think, Hera, what you just mentioned as to folks that are already not reaching out, right? Women and girls and individuals who are female identifying, we see that tenfold with men and boys, right? That there are not safe spaces to come forward and talk about what's happening, that the need to get help or to ask for help, that deep shame is so rooted within different systems that we could spend the whole day talking about, that we want to make sure that as we move forward with this emerging issue that is changing every single day, that we create those spaces and we validate those experiences as well, that violence is violence, sexual violence is sexual violence, removing an individual's ability to consent to their image, or whether that's synthetic or not, is something that we have to express across every single individual and human. So I think that's something we are really passionate about at Sanar, is really talking about how we heal and how we all have a right to heal, regardless of where we come from, what background we are. And I think whether it's men and boys or other folks that haven't been included in this conversation, we really have so much of a tremendous opportunity to make sure that we're shining that light into other areas where we can learn lessons from sister fields and understand that there is huge importance in this and the work that each of us are doing.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. Yeah, it's a real, men and boys don't typically find themselves as a victim class when it comes to online violence. And so they are wholly unprepared when they are targeted. And as a result, due to malformed beliefs about healthy masculinity or restrictive masculinity, that they choose self-harm, they choose isolation, they do not seek help, see it as not being masculine, as shameful. And so really naming it, creating space for them to come forward, identifying this as a crime, it's not something to be ashamed of, is really critically important, and making sure that they feel seen and heard. So I love that you touched on that. There is a question in the chat that I want to get to, but both of you, I'm going off script a little bit, because both of you have mentioned something that I think we have to name here, which is consent and bodily autonomy around this. I think reframing consent and bodily autonomy, there's a huge opportunity to reframe consent and bodily autonomy when people take images of our bodies and manipulate them and twist them and exploit them, because we've typically talked about bodily autonomy in the physical sense, and we are starting to expand the conversation to include our digital bodily autonomy. I hesitate to even call it digital bodily autonomy. It's just bodily autonomy, by saying, hey, you need to get permission from me before you post that photo online. But this deepfake abuse, synthetic image abuse, is a really, I think, perfect example of why really leaning into the bodily autonomy conversation around consent is important. Do either of you want to sort of expand on what you talked about when you were talking about consent and bodily autonomy? Because I think it's a really important point to make. And if
Yeah,
not,
sure. And I think I also want to
Okay.
hear what you think, Adam, because I think you've been working on this issue as well as really highlighting it for a while. So I want to throw it back to you too after we're done. I think that the thing that I find interesting is that how it's used as a in interpersonal relationships, or in intimate settings. It's kind of used as a way of shaming someone, threatening, like bringing shame on them. That is the kind of framing that's used, on their families and communities. We see this a lot in South Asian contexts and Middle Eastern contexts. And then when it comes to, and then the same tactic is used around women in the public eye, especially politicians. It's almost to show them their place, of making it so that it damages their careers. But the underlying thing that I find interesting in the woman in the public eye is that it's to say, and it happens to civil society leaders as well and activists as well. It's to basically say, well, what would you expect? It's that kind of attitude of like, well, this is unfortunate, but they're in the public eye. Someone's gonna do this, and then it almost like it becomes like it's not a bipartisan issue. It's treated as if it's like a political thing. It's like, well, this person did this, which is why then someone did this to them. So I think it's almost like people go to such lengths to defend that. And whereas irrespective of what someone's political views are or their career has been, the fact that people have a right to privacy, the people that have right to have their bodies respected, especially in the public space, is so important. The web is a public space. The digital landscape is a public space. I think that is where we really start seeing that gnarly bits of like sort of patriarchy and like sort of misogyny coming out. And also what kind of like, I think it's interesting to see like what kind of women are targeted with this as well, on the sort of like the political landscape in like when you're talking about like everyday people. And like, given that the research in 2023 from Home Security Heroes found that like 99% of the victims and targets of deepfake pornography were women. I think it's quite stark that like that there is like this, you know, again, showing women their place, saying that I can do this to you, you know, like this is a power thing as well. And is not taking it seriously, the impact of those actions. Someone asked a question, and I think it kind of touches on that as well, is like, you know, what kind of education needs to happen? There's so many things that need to happen, but I think actually looking at the roots of why someone feels like they can do this, and then why are people surprised, which I think is more interesting. Why are people surprised, especially younger people, that it's become a big deal? Like, what is it about women's bodies that and like manipulate them, and especially when you know it's going to cause them harm? Why is that harm so easy to discount in someone's head? And that's what we need to tackle.
Oops, unmute myself there. Yeah, Kate, do you have something to add?
I was just going to say, I want to second everything Hera said. I've got the only other thing that sparked for me was on the other side of that, on the healing perspective, but also the harm perspective at that individual level, right? When we think about the digital world as a public space, and for many of us who've experienced sexual violence in the physical world, right? Not in the digital space where there's that history of complex polyvictimization, right? So different kinds of violence that we experience across our life course. There's now a whole new place where victimization is happening, and that there's a lack of safety. So when we think about how we build safety moving forward in education, I think we also need to look at what the impact is on women and girls who have now had an entirely new place to be violated, an entirely new place to be victimized, an entirely new message to say, listen, if you say something I don't like, or if you do something or do nothing, right? This idea of like, you've done something. If you've done absolutely nothing but exist, you will still be targeted. There is nothing that you can do necessarily to protect yourself. So I think that idea of what we can do, well, we can create safety nets, we can create systems and accountability, but I think we also can't ignore what happens to our nervous system, our self-concept, our ability to feel safe going out in every single facet of our life, when this is the kind of violence that we can experience simply by existing in a digital world today.
Well said. Women, girls, marginalized folks, they've been disproportionately targeted with violence in the physical world, and that is carried forward in the digital world as well. And I think it's even amplified in so many ways. And, the point that I think, Hera, you mentioned patriarchy and misogyny, and we've talked about, I just would be remiss. There's not a lot of people that look like me on panels talking about these issues, being heard, being a bystander, being an ally. And this is not a violence against women and girls issue. This is not a issue that only affects marginalized folks or LGBTQ plus folks. It affects all of us, and we desperately need allyship. I don't want to be the only person in the room that looks like me. And so, not to get on my soapbox here, but it's incredibly frustrating that I can't, that we can't. It's a privilege issue, right? Hey, I'm a white male, so this doesn't affect me like it affects other people, so I'm not going to care about it. Well, that's trash, right? And we really need to disrupt that. And I think by raising awareness about these issues, talking about it in schools, we can sort of set up the next generation to stand up more and be more visible when it comes to these issues. So I don't want to get on a rant and get all hot, but it just drives me bonkers. So Kate, I have a question for you. I have a lot of questions for you, but when working, if someone is seeking to support a victim or survivor of deepfake abuse or IBSA, well, either really, what are some surprising ways that you've seen trauma manifest that we need to be ready for in those circumstances?
That's a great question. There's kind of a two-part answer I'll have. One is, at Sanar, we've been working on key considerations for trauma and thinking about how does trauma manifest, how does it look, and we use a three-part framework that trauma is subjective, right? So my experience versus Hera's experience versus Adam's experience are all going to be different based on the whole host of life experiences that we've had coming up to this point. And if we experience that form of violence, the way I experience it and respond will likely be different. We can find some themes and talk about that, but remembering that each time it's going to be subjective to our own unique experiences, but that it's also intersectional, right? So this doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is a culmination of all of the different experiences, marginalizations, oppressions, and forms of violence that we've experienced. It's oftentimes not just one. So we have to think about the intersectional nature of that, whether that's individual of our own histories, whether that's collective or intergenerational of our communities, our families, our ancestors. So really thinking about that. And the third is that it's adaptive, right? The way we respond to trauma and our responses in the aftermath of these forms of violence, they're designed to keep us safe. Sometimes our nervous system and our neurobiology gets it wrong, but the essential underpinning of it is to keep us safe. So some of those surprising things that we may see where someone goes into hyper arousal, right? So that's speediness of kind of what we think of as fight or flight responses. We may see someone who is desperately trying to remove content 24 hours a day, trying to find every single website where this has happened in an attempt to keep us safe or to mitigate what has happened. On the other side of that, we may see that hypoarousal, that sense of being shut down that we often think of with our freeze response or our fawn response. And this may mean we're not responding to messages. We're not engaging with the digital world. We don't want to go outside. We are completely shut down and can't engage. So when we think about those two pieces, what we always like to look at is that window of tolerance, right? In between hyperarousal and hypoarousal is that sweet spot where we feel regulated and we can use all those beautiful things like our prefrontal cortex to make decisions. So when we see someone who's maybe not there, we can also look at, okay, this is maybe what someone is experiencing, and let's talk about how we can come back into that window of tolerance without judgment, without a sense of knowing that we would do it differently. And the last thing I think I would add to that is, we don't choose our trauma responses, right? We don't choose how we respond to these forms of violence. So if there is something that we're experiencing or engaging in, oftentimes it is an automatic response in an effort to keep us safe into an environment that we've never experienced before, right? So there's no template for this. So I hope that that sort of gives a sense of what we can do is be present, right? What we can ensure that we're doing in the aftermath of this, or as people are navigating it, is that we sit and we listen and we hear and we support where they are in that moment. And we create as much of a safer, I'll avoid saying safe situation, and even from an emotional perspective as well, right? What do I need today to feel safe in myself, in my thoughts, in my body, and sort of focusing on those places, regardless of where someone falls in that spectrum.
Yeah, thank you so much. When people ask me, how can I respond to somebody who's been inserted into a deepfake without their consent, two of the things that I'll often suggest that they do is be very clear that they believe them, that they believe that this is not actually them, because then this may surprise everyone attending a summit called, a deepfake summit, but people are also still unaware of this technology, and it tricks our eyes into believing that what we're seeing is really happening. And I've worked with survivors who have either been questioned, like, this is clearly you, I can't help you if you're not honest with me, or there's a fear, an underlying fear that they won't be believed. So I'm always very intentional that I believe them, that I'm aware of this technology, that they're not alone, that this is happening to a lot of people. And the other thing I do is I validate the harm. I think something that has come up a lot in everybody's responses is like this is often confused as like a joke or funny or not a big deal because it's fake or synthetic. And it's so deeply traumatizing, so harmful, so disempowering. Being sexualized and fetishized over and over without your consent by strangers all over the internet is just, we're still unpacking. It's such a new form of abuse. And so the trauma is new and nuanced. And so really acknowledging the harm, that even though the images are synthetic, their harm, the trauma is very authentic. And I find that helps folks feel heard. When it comes to resources, Hera, one thing that I love that you do at Chayn is when a resource doesn't exist, you create them. So can you, because we had a question on the Q&A, can you talk, because what you've done is with Bloom is create courses, not necessarily for victim service providers, but for survivors. Can you talk a little bit about that offering and those resources and what you focus on? Because I think folks would be really interested.
Yeah, thank you. Our whole purpose is to support survivors with their trauma and their healing journey, which, because it can be really lonely to experience that yourself. And also because we focus on this globally, we find that a lot of people just don't have that many advocates around them. They might not have free services. They might not be able to afford, therapy. There might be loads and loads of barriers for them to actually get support. So we want to create as much free support as possible. So the courses that we have are all written from this like sort of psycho-social perspective, but really just also about like validating, like you said, Adam, like what someone's experienced. The number one thing that we find is that people have either not been believed or they themselves blame themselves. There's this thing of like guilt, of like, having anger towards yourself, having anger towards others, having anger towards systems that have failed you, and feeling hopeless, alone, and that, just swerving between like, it was all my fault. I could have avoided this. I could have done something about it, to being like, nobody cares about me. And, there's no, like my pain is not of value to other people. They don't see me as, they don't see the pain that I'm experiencing. So that's the thing that our courses do. So the course that we've recently, which is around like healing from image-based abuse, and we call it image-based abuse. We don't call it image-based sexual abuse, because in many of the contexts and communities that we work in across the world, just adding the word sexual implies that someone was engaging in sexual activity, whereas we know that's not the case. So we actually very purposefully don't say that. I know that it's a very popular phrasing in North America, but just like putting it out there that we, as a global organization, do not do that. And it really goes into things like shame that you feel, and also shame that others may feel on your behalf, and how that affects you. A lot of survivors say things like, I'm so upset that this is affected like my father. This is affecting like my children. And feeling not just your own shame, but also like, even though it's not someone's shame to carry, I just like want to say that, but we can keep saying that, but people will still feel it, because that's how we've been socialized. So really going into these emotions and saying like, this is like not something that you want to do. And the other thing that I think that's really important is that we have a live chat, so people can chat with our team of trained specialists. They can do that in 5 languages, where we can reflect on what they're learning. So even though we're not able to provide crisis support, it's like it's a reflection service where you can be like, actually, I saw that video that was about, for example, guilt, and that made me think of this. And then you have someone to discuss it with, so you don't feel alone. I think that the thing that really kills a lot of hope in you is feeling that you're alone in that, and that there's nobody out there that cares. So really like working on that actually, sadly, a lot of people go through this experience. A lot of women go through this experience. A lot of non-binary people go through this experience. A lot of racialized people go through this experience. And we want to be there for people in that place is really important. And I also, one of the things is that something that Chayn is doing more of is doing research. And I think we actually are quite, I think we should give a shout out to all the people who are writing stories on this, also doing research, all the survivors speaking out, because it is actually making the case for us working on this much more stronger.
That's amazing. Yeah, I encourage folks to visit Hera's website or her organization's website, because there is just, it's as intersectional as it gets, right? They really, and just, I loved how you explained image-based abuse versus image-based sexual abuse, and how that might impact somebody, that's not, in the US, right? And from this sort of very linear view of victimization in the US, and how in other countries, like doesn't have to be sexualized imagery to be harmful, right? And I think that's so important. Did you want to add? I can't tell if there's anything you want to add to that. I don't want to go off that, but I just think that's really powerful, because intersectionality is such an important I think it's one of the easiest things to forget in our work, and it's simultaneously one of the most, if not the most important thing that we need to be mindful of in our work, is to remain intersectional. And one thing, Hera, that you talked about was isolation, right? And how what you offer helps, whether it's through chat or through the courses or both, helps victims and survivors not feel as alone, because we know that victims will isolate, right? Will self-isolate in the face of this type of abuse. Kate, if you're working with someone who's isolating, how do you have some thoughts on how you can share about how you approach that might be helpful to folks that are in attendance today?
Sure. I mean, Adam, I loved what you shared before, which is validating, listening, and believing, right? I think one of the things that we know from the research is the relationship matters, right? The most powerful tool that we have on this planet is ourselves, and how we use it and how we engage with others. So when we see someone, whether it's in our community, someone that we're working with in our professional realm that's isolating, we can listen, we can be present, we can do so with unconditional positive regard of what that person is experiencing without needing to change what they're facing in that moment. We can remain consistent, right? So whether you are a service provider who is listening to this, consistency matters. How we show up and what we are able to provide, how we set expectations around that is important as well. But also, I think access is really critical with isolation, right? So we can do all of these magical things and be present and use ourselves as a tool that can help with connection. But if individuals don't know how to get out of isolation, if they don't know where to go for support, if when they do reach out for support, there are thousands of barriers where they are met with any sense of re-engagement in that shame or self-blame, all of those pieces shut down that connection, right? So I think we can just be mindful of those aspects. But also, I think as a global community, we can sit down and listen and say, what can we do to break this sense of being alone in this experience? Is it education and awareness, right? And understanding that this is not our fault and that there isn't shame to carry, as Hera said, right? Those pieces, I think they all go a long way. On the other side of that, one of the things that we have found is building community, right? Having community that is healthy and oriented around healing and feels like they get us and understand our experiences and honor our privacy and trust in ways that has been just fundamentally dismantled through this form of violence. I think all of those really matter in bringing people out of isolation. I think the other thing is seeing positive examples, right? When we see that justice and healing is possible, when we see that we can move forward in our lives through other people who have done it before us, whether that's someone who's in our community or that we see at a global scale, it all matters in how we see the world around us. So I think those are small ways and large ways that we can do it. And I think the last one is just ensuring that we stay grounded on our common humanity throughout all of this.
Amazing, thank you. For folks that are took their time out of their day to be with us today, this panel is about resources, and you may notice that we didn't just come firing out with, well, here's this tool and here's this website and here, because institutionally, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're not quite there yet where these really functional, effective tools exist. But there are some that I think that we should name. And when responding to deepfake abuse or synthetic image-based abuse, it's important to, I think, understand that the playbook is very similar to just image-based abuse or image-based sexual abuse. We sort of do the same things. Things like de-indexing the photo's location from Google search so that it's harder to find. It doesn't remove it from the website itself, but it makes it harder to locate. We are advocating for Google to simply remove all non-consensual deepfake intimate imagery from search rather than shifting the burden to victims and survivors. But this is where we are right now. We can also go to websites like stopncii.org if you had to stop non-consensual intimate image abuse.org. They work with all major social media platforms to help basically be an early warning system if somebody tries to upload an intimate image, whether authentic or synthetic, to TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, all of them, right? And the nice thing about this is it's very trauma informed in the sense that victims and survivors do not have to give the photo over to anybody. A fingerprint is basically made of the photo, and that is what's shared. So the survivor keeps, their privacy and dignity intact. And in the US, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has a Take It Down website to get authentic and synthetic intimate images of minors taken down as well. And most mainstream platforms have portals to remove non-consensual images from their platforms. Mainstream, even like Pornhub has them. So not my favorite, yes, in the chat, the venerable Sophie Mortimer, who is one of the driving forces behind the platform that I just mentioned, included the link to stop NCII in the Q&A. So feel free, please feel free to check it out there. And then a lot of, and I'm sorry, I want to make sure I get these resources out before the end. I get a lot of questions saying, well, how can we prevent this? How can we prevent people using these undressing apps? How can people prevent the creation of non-consensual deepfake intimate imagery? And from a technology standpoint, we can't. And so, because even if they created, people are using non-explicit content and changing it to be something explicit, and we can't stop people from doing that. But what we can do is raise awareness, right? And we've sort of already talked about this. The way we prevent this is by communicating and raising awareness in our communities and our schools about this technology and why it's harmful. And hopefully those folks who would otherwise use this technology might question whether they should, and we need to get the information out there. Do either of you have any other sort of resources that you recommend? They could be deepfake focused or not really. Anything that you think victims of online gender-based violence would benefit from? Are there any? Do either of you have any resources you'd like to recommend? And then we have some questions that we'll definitely get to.
I can jump on just really quickly. On the service side, Sanar is launching what we're calling Project Lighthouse, which will provide no-cost therapy, case advocacy, community-oriented and healing workshops, and a whole variety of other services. So you can find information on our website about that. We would be happy to support any individual or community member who needs additional resources or support. It's predominantly US based. We have done some work internationally as well, so I do want to flag that. But those are all direct services that are not just focused on the healing aspect, but also connecting to other service providers. And we will also be launching a service provider directory. So anyone here who is starting to do this work, who has been leading this work for far longer than we have at Sanar, we would love to connect with you as well to make sure that we are collaborating. I think that's one of the strongest things we can do as well, is make sure we're referring to everyone who is leading and doing this amazing work throughout the globe.
Yeah, I mean, I think Adam's gone through all of them. And also, like, we've already gone through some of the Chayn resources, so do have a look at that. I would also say the thing, just something that gets mentioned, doesn't get mentioned as much, but I think it's really important, is that if you are working with someone who, if you are approached by someone who knows someone who's going through this, you can do a lot to support that person, because we all need bystanders. It's not just about bystanders, it's about like friends and family, co-workers. How can everybody really play their role in supporting? I think it's that's the part that often gets missed. And actually, Kate mentioned consistency. I think that consistency is actually one of the hardest things to build within us as individuals, of offering support. People often offer support at the beginning, I find. When someone here like, oh my God, terrible, I want to help you. How can I help you? Tell me, just I'll be there. But actually what someone needs is you to be there consistently for a long time, because someone can't just move on like this from this, it takes time. So I would say that, as someone who wants to help people, think about those things too.
Amazing. Thank you, Hera. We have two questions. So one, I think I can answer pretty quickly. How can we help pressure Google on the de-indexing or search result elimination issue? So Unfortunately, Google doesn't have like an 800 number where we can call them up and tell them. But, you know, if you can write a letter to your local legislator that this is a problem, you can seek out, there are articles. Wired recently wrote one, a great journalist named Matt Burgess wrote an article on this, and we can repost this on social media. We can amplify it on social media. We can be talking about it. I don't think people are really aware of it. And so we need to be naming it, because I think folks are wholly unaware of it. And then another question was, and I think I will defer to Kate and Hera on this one, or Kate, I'll ask you this. The question is, as a victim of sexual assault, what are some resources that would help me become more okay with it?
That's something where I can definitely also leave contact information if folks would like to connect on that one-on-one. I will absolutely prioritize responding, so I'm happy to do that in the chat as well. And you know, there are a lot of different resources, support, and different options and pathways for any of us who've experienced sexual assault or sexual violence. So I think wanting to do justice to that question and looking at all of the different paths, I'm happy to share some resources afterwards, but also I think anything that we've talked about today, right? Having support systems, community, healing spaces, places we can unpack what's happened to us, and to move towards and remember that we are resilient individuals and humans, and that with the right ingredients, support, and consistency, I think is the word, we can develop post-traumatic growth and things that really allow us to move forward in those ways. So I'm happy to connect in any way that feels right after this on that as well.
Yeah, and I'll just say that, you know, if you're looking for support in person, then look at the organizations that are around you that do that. And they're, you know, I don't know where you're based, but if they are, then yeah, seek those out. And if you find that they are like, you know, things like waiting lists, or you aren't able to get the support that you're looking for, and also otherwise, please do look at Chayn's website. We have a bunch of free resources, including a course on Bloom, which is specifically about healing from sexual trauma. And I will just say that, you know, I'm is like, hold yourself dearly, and that it's you know, know that it's not your fault, and that it's, you know, healing is a very personal process. No two people's healing journey looks the same. So and yet, you know, you try different things to see what is it that you actually need and what is it that you find useful.
Yeah, this is so great. I think I wanted to add something. You know, I started just sort of listing all the different things survivors can do, removing from Google search and stop NCII, but it's still shifting the burden to them, right? And so that can be a really exhausting process. And this is, you know, in some platforms, you know, not the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children or Stop NCII, but reporting to like social media and things like that, survivors have described the reporting process as re-traumatizing. So setting expectations about, I don't mean to say, oh yeah, just report it. We have to set expectations, especially with the larger platforms, that there's not a lot of transparency there. You don't hear about the status of your report to get something taken down. You don't know when you often aren't told when or why action was or wasn't taken. So it can be a disempowering process in and of itself. And so just making sure people have the appropriate expectations when they do seek some of those like more larger stream resources out, I think is really important. And I know that it's no longer in the Q&A, but there was a question about that Hera touched on about creating curriculums and programs in schools, right? And I would just circle back all the way back to the beginning, that we already talk about in many countries and jurisdictions, when we're talking to youth, we talk about healthy relationships, we talk about consent, we talk about boundaries, we talk about safety and trust and kindness. And I think it's really important to remember that those things look and feel very differently online and behind a screen. And it's necessary that we adapt the way we talk about giving and getting permission, for example, with consent, to include the online experiences that students and youth are having, because Otherwise, they're not gonna. It's not going to connect for them when they're online, especially when they don't see the other person that they may be harming. They may not, it's not a visceral, there's visceral experience. They don't feel accountable. There's a lack of empathy there. And so really educating and using things like deepfake abuse, which is interesting, right, to a lot of people. They want to know about it, making that the vehicle that we use to talk about consent. Did they give permission to have this done of them, right? And when we start drilling down into giving and getting permission, it's a black or white issue, right? And it becomes very clear when you look at it through that lens, and you sort of overcome a lot of victim blaming and a lot of bias that folks tend to bring to those conversations. So that's so we just have 2 minutes. Muted myself. Would either of you like to say anything in closing before we wrap up?
I just want to say that I am just in so much awe of all the survivors who have spoken out about this, who are using something that's really difficult and sometimes so public and just so yeah, really, really difficult, and doing this work and making sure that they're pulling everybody together. I also want to thank all the advocates who work on this issue. And lastly, I want to apologize for my baby who has interrupted us many times today, but he is a baby and he does not know that we are talking about important things here. And yeah, just thank you very much for this opportunity to be here.
And I echo all of those different sentiments from Hera, and also really honored to be here with Adam and Hera today. This was a wonderful conversation. I think I always like to close out when we're talking about these forms of violence, also in thinking about, healing is a part of our journey, and that there are so many avenues that we can do that in the aftermath of this. So as much as we talk about the impact of the violence and the trauma, that resilience and healing is the other side of that coin. We can't talk about this without it. And so making sure that we build equal spaces to talk about how we come back and build forward after situations like this in our lives.
Amazing. Thank you all for hosting us. We want to be respectful of the next panel, but have an amazing rest of the conference. And thank you to everybody, Ruben, Sophie, everybody that made it happen. Have a great rest of the conference, everybody. Take care.